At a busy airport, the energy was buzzing as passengers hurried to board their flights. Among them was a tall man with a confident stride and a sharp suit that screamed success. He had worked hard for years, building his career step by step, and today he was finally sitting in first class. It wasn't just any flight, it was an international journey bound for Paris. The excitement of traveling in luxury filled him with pride. As he walked down the jet bridge, he couldn't help but feel like he belonged right where he was. The first-class cabin was everything you'd expect: plush leather seats, extra legroom, and quiet surroundings. The man found his assigned seat, near the window, tucked his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, and settled in. He adjusted his tie, glanced out the window at the runway, and let out a small sigh of satisfaction. This was the reward for all those late nights and early mornings grinding away at work. Moments later, the pilot stepped onto the plane. From the moment he entered the cabin, his presence commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing his uniform with an air of superiority, this pilot exuded arrogance. His nameplate read Captain Richard Hale, though most people just called him the arrogant one behind his back. Stories about his condescending attitude had spread among airline staff for years. To him, passengers were nothing more than faceless bodies on his aircraft, and he made little effort to hide his disdain for anyone who crossed his path. As Captain Hale moved through the aisle, something caught his eye: a well-dressed black man sitting comfortably in first class. For reasons unknown even to himself, the sight irritated him. Without thinking twice, he stopped beside the passenger seat and leaned in slightly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Excuse me, sir," he said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Are you sure this is your seat? This section is reserved for premium travelers." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Everyone within earshot froze, unsure of how to react. Some turned their heads discreetly, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged glances, silently questioning what they were witnessing. The man in the seat looked up calmly, meeting the pilot's gaze without flinching. There was no anger in his expression, only surprise at the unexpected confrontation. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and held it up for the pilot to see. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied evenly, his voice steady, despite the tension crackling between them. But instead of backing off or offering an apology, Captain Hale doubled down. He smirked, leaning closer now, his tone mocking. "Well, I'm glad we cleared that up," he said, his words laced with insincerity. Then came the real blow. "You know, sometimes people make mistakes, or maybe someone helped you get here." Implication was clear, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Others stared openly, disbelief etched across their faces. Was this really happening? On a fancy international flight? The man didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he kept his composure, refusing to let the pilot rattle him. Still, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, watching how he would respond. Inside, he felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and sadness. But outwardly, he remained calm. He knew better than to engage in a shouting match with someone who thrived on belittling others. A member of the cabin crew tried to step in, whispering softly to the pilot. "Sir, perhaps we should move on," she suggested nervously, aware of the growing discomfort among the passengers. But Captain Hale waved her off dismissively, unwilling to back down. "This isn't about moving on," he snapped, addressing the crew member before turning his attention back to the man. "It's about ensuring everyone feels comfortable during the flight, and frankly, some passengers might not appreciate sharing their space with certain individuals." The room fell deathly silent. Even the hum of pre-flight preparations seemed to fade into the background. Those words hit like a punch to the gut, not just for the man being targeted, but for everyone listening. One elderly woman sitting nearby couldn't take it anymore. She leaned forward in her seat, her voice firm and unwavering. "That's enough," she exclaimed, glaring at the pilot. "What you're doing is wrong, and quite frankly, it's disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourself." Her words broke the spell of silence, prompting murmurs of agreement from other passengers. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording the scene, capturing every second of the escalating drama. Another traveler chimed in, saying, "Yeah, leave him alone. He paid for his ticket just like the rest of us." Despite the mounting backlash, Captain Hale refused to budge. If anything, he grew more aggressive, demanding that the man switch seats to avoid causing further discomfort for the other passengers. Reluctantly, the man gathered his belongings and stood up, but not before delivering a quiet yet powerful parting shot. "Your arrogance will catch up with you someday." With that, he moved to another seat farther back in the cabin, leaving behind a trail of stunned faces and simmering resentment. Little did anyone know, those prophetic words would prove truer than anyone could have imagined. The tension in the cabin didn't ease after the man moved to another seat. Instead, it lingered like a storm cloud hovering overhead, casting a shadow over what should have been a luxurious and relaxing flight. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier excitement replaced by discomfort and unease. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just unfolded. Others sat stiffly in their seats, pretending to focus on their books or phones but secretly replaying the scene in their minds. Captain Hale, still standing near the front of the plane, seemed oblivious to the disapproval radiating from the passengers around him. Or maybe he simply didn't care. Either way, he returned to his usual routine, checking with the crew and preparing for takeoff as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But the atmosphere in the cabin told a different story. It was thick with unspoken judgment, and even the flight attendants moved about their tasks with an unusual stiffness, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to discuss the incident. Meanwhile, the man who had been humiliated found himself seated farther back in the cabin. Though technically still in first class, this new spot lacked the privacy and comfort of his original seat. He stared out the window, watching ground staff scurry around the tarmac below, but his mind wasn't on the view. He replayed the confrontation, in his head dissecting every word, every tone, and every glance. He thought about how calm he had stayed, how he hadn't let the pilot's words provoke him into losing his cool. And yet, despite his composure, he couldn't shake the sting of being treated as though he didn't belong. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, far from it, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Each instance chipped away at a person, no matter how strong they were. Still, he reminded himself that reacting with anger wouldn't solve anything. Dignity, he believed, was its own form of power. As the plane taxied down the runway and prepared for takeoff, the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier leaned toward her neighbor. "Can you believe that?" she asked, her voice low but tinged with outrage. Her neighbor, a middle-aged man wearing glasses, nodded grimly. "It's unbelievable," he replied. "That guy thinks he's better than everyone else because he wears a fancy uniform. I've never seen anything like it." Their conversation caught the attention of others nearby, sparking a ripple effect of whispers throughout the cabin. One passenger, a young woman traveling alone, pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. She posted a short message on social media. "Just witnessed a pilot embarrass a fellow passenger in first class. Totally unnecessary and disgusting behavior. Unacceptable." Within minutes, her post gained traction, drawing comments from friends and strangers alike. Someone suggested she share more details, prompting her to start recording snippets of the ongoing murmurs among passengers. Back in the cockpit, Captain Hale remained clueless about the brewing storm. To him, the incident was already forgotten, a minor blip in his day. He prided himself on running a tight ship, and in his mind, addressing issues like the one he'd encountered was part of maintaining order. What he failed to realize, however, was that his actions had left a lasting impression, not just on the man he'd targeted, but on everyone else on board. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the situation had escalated beyond the confines of the aircraft. Videos and posts from passengers started flooding social media platforms, accompanied by hashtags like pilot shaming and #stand against racism. People around the world tuned in, outraged by the footage showing the pilot's dismissive attitude and blatant disrespect. Clips of the elderly woman confronting him went viral, with viewers praising her courage for speaking up when no one else dared to. News outlets quickly picked up the story, turning what had started as a personal altercation into a global scandal. Reporters scrambled to piece together details, interviewing passengers who had witnessed the exchange firsthand. One traveler described the pilot's behavior as condescending and cruel, while another called it a textbook example of prejudice masquerading as authority. The man at the center of the controversy, meanwhile, chose not to comment publicly, at least not yet. He preferred to process the events privately before deciding how to respond. For the airline, the backlash was swift and severe. Calls for accountability poured in from all corners of the globe, with customers threatening to boycott the carrier unless action was taken. Social media users tagged the company in countless posts, demanding answers and justice. At first, the airline issued a vague statement promising to investigate the matter, but the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted concrete steps, not empty promises. Under mounting pressure, the airline announced that Captain Hale had been suspended pending further review. The news spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and sparking heated debates about professionalism, privilege, and accountability in high-stakes industries like aviation. For many, the suspension felt like a step in the right direction, though some argued it wasn't enough. How could someone in such a position of trust and responsibility act so recklessly? And why had it taken a viral scandal for the airline to take notice? As the hours passed, the man reflected on the whirlwind of events. He knew the spotlight would eventually shift away from him, as it always did. But for now, he found himself thrust into the role of an unwilling public figure. Strangers sent messages of support, sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking him for handling the situation with grace. Others urged him to file a formal complaint against the pilot, insisting that silence only perpetuated the cycle of injustice. Despite the overwhelming attention, he remained grounded. He understood that the real fight wasn't against one arrogant individual. It was against the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. And while he hadn't asked for this moment in the spotlight, he recognized its potential to spark meaningful change. For now, though, he focused on staying present, knowing that the journey ahead would require patience, resilience, and unwavering determination. Little did anyone know, the fallout from that single interaction would reverberate far beyond the walls of the airplane, reshaping lives and challenging long-held beliefs about power, privilege, and accountability. By the time the plane touched down in Paris, the story of what had happened on board was already making waves far beyond the airport terminal. Social media timelines were flooded with posts about the arrogant pilot and the man he had humiliated. Videos taken by passengers showed snippets of the heated exchange, capturing not only the pilot's cutting remarks, but also the reactions of those around him. Shocked faces, whispered conversations, and the elderly woman boldly confronting the pilot. The hashtag #ArrogantPilotExposed trended globally, sparking outrage and debate across continents. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some shared their anger, calling the pilot's behavior unacceptable and shameful. Others expressed admiration for the way the man handled himself, praising his calm demeanor in the face of blatant disrespect. Comment sections turned into forums where users recounted their own experiences of discrimination or mistreatment while traveling. One commenter wrote, "I've been there before, made to feel like I didn't belong because of how I look. It's exhausting, but seeing someone stand tall like that gives me hope." News outlets jumped on the story, amplifying the voices of ordinary people who had witnessed the incident firsthand. Reporters reached out to passengers asking them to recount what they saw and how it made them feel. A young traveler, still jet-lagged from the long flight, described the tension in the cabin. "It was like watching a movie unfold right in front of us. You could feel everyone getting angrier as the pilot kept doubling down. No one deserved to be treated like that." As the scandal gained momentum, the airline found itself at the center of a media firestorm. Initially, the company tried to downplay the situation, releasing a carefully worded statement that promised an internal investigation. But the public wasn't buying it. Thousands of customers took to Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to demand answers. "An investigation isn't enough. one user tweeted. "This pilot needs to be fired immediately. How can we trust this airline after something like this?" The pressure mounted rapidly. Within hours, major sponsors began pulling their partnerships with the airline, citing concerns over brand reputation. Influencers and frequent flyers announced boycotts, vowing not to book flights with the carrier until real change occurred. Even competitors seized the opportunity to position themselves as more ethical alternatives. For the airline, the financial implications were staggering, but the damage to its image proved even worse. Amidst the chaos, the man at the heart of the controversy decided to break his silence. He gave an interview to a popular news channel, speaking candidly about his experience. Sitting in a quiet hotel room in Paris, he looked directly into the camera, his expression calm but resolute. "What happened on that flight wasn't just about me," he said. "It was about the assumptions people make based on appearances. It was about the power dynamics that exist in spaces like first class. And most importantly, it was about how we respond when faced with injustice." His words resonated deeply. Viewers praised his eloquence and poise, noting how he refrained from resorting to bitterness or hatred, despite the hurtful treatment he endured. Instead, he used the platform to highlight broader issues of inequality and prejudice. "These kinds of incidents happen every day," he continued. "They might not always go viral, but they leave scars all the same. My hope is that this moment sparks a conversation, a chance for us to reflect on how we treat each other and how we hold institutions accountable." The interview went viral almost instantly, drawing millions of views within hours. People rallied behind him, hailing him as a symbol of dignity and resilience. Hashtags like #respect for all and accountability matters began trending alongside the original ones, signaling a shift in the narrative. What started as outrage toward one individual evolved into a larger movement advocating for fairness and inclusion. Meanwhile, Captain Hale remained oblivious to the full extent of the fallout, at least at first. When he landed in Paris, he strutted off the plane as if nothing unusual had happened. To him, the encounter was a minor inconvenience, a fleeting disagreement that would soon fade from memory. He expected to return home, rest for a few days, and resume flying as usual. But reality hit hard when he opened his phone. Notifications poured in non-stop. Messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers. At first, he dismissed them as exaggerations, convinced that the whole thing would blow over quickly. After all, he reasoned, pilots held positions of authority for a reason. Who would side with a passenger over someone entrusted with hundreds of lives? Reality proved otherwise. As he scrolled through social media, he saw video after video of the incident, accompanied by captions labeling him as arrogant, racist, and unprofessional. Former co-workers came forward with stories of similar behavior, painting a picture of a man who thrived on belittling others to boost his own ego. One junior pilot recounted being berated during training, while a flight attendant revealed how she had once reported him for inappropriate comments only to be ignored by management. The tide had turned completely against him. Sponsors dropped their endorsements, leaving his side gigs as a brand ambassador in shambles. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone embroiled in such controversy. Even family members struggled to defend him, torn between loyalty and disbelief at his actions. Facing mounting criticism, the airline finally acted. In a press conference streamed live online, executives announced that Captain Hale had been permanently terminated. His flying license, too, was revoked following an emergency review by aviation authorities. The decision sent shockwaves through the industry, serving as a stark reminder that no one, not even seasoned professionals, was above accountability. For many, the announcement brought a sense of closure. Justice, though delayed, felt served. Yet for others it raised deeper questions about systemic issues within the aviation world. Why had such behavior gone unchecked for so long? How many others had suffered silently under similar circumstances? These lingering uncertainties underscored the need for lasting reform, pushing both the airline and its peers to reevaluate their practices. As the dust settled, the man sat alone in his hotel room, scrolling through social media updates. Messages of support continued to pour in, thanking him for inspiring courage and reminding others to stand up for themselves. Though grateful for the outpouring of kindness, he knew the fight was far from over. This moment, however significant, was just one step toward creating a world where respect and equality weren't privileges reserved for a select few, but rights extended to everyone. For Captain Hale, the road ahead loomed uncertain. Stripped of his career and reputation, he retreated from public view, grappling with shame and regret. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Would he find redemption? Or would this mark the end of his journey? Only time would tell. The days following the scandal were a blur for the pilot. At first, he tried to convince himself that everything would blow over, that people were overreacting and the world would soon forget about him. He clung to the belief that his years of experience and seniority in the aviation industry made him untouchable. But as the reality of his situation sank in, denial gave way to anger, then frustration, and finally, a deep sense of isolation. Stripped of his job, his license, and his reputation, he found himself adrift. The life he had built, the one he prided himself on, was crumbling around him. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues avoided him like the plague. Even acquaintances who once fawned over his status as a seasoned pilot now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. It was as if he had become invisible, erased from the lives of those who once admired him. At home, the silence was deafening. Days stretched into weeks and the emptiness gnawed at him. He spent hours staring at the walls, replaying the incident in his mind. At first, he convinced himself it wasn't entirely his fault. That guy should have understood I was just doing my job, he muttered to himself late at night. He could have handled it differently. But the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. A big one. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was paying the price. The weight of public shame pressed down on him relentlessly. Every time he opened social media, he saw posts criticizing him, memes mocking him, and articles dissecting his behavior. One viral post featured a side-by-side comparison, a picture of him smirking during the confrontation next to an image of the man he had humiliated, calm and composed despite the attack. The caption read, "This is what privilege looks like. Here's what dignity looks like." Comments flooded in, with users pointing out how the contrast spoke volumes about character. Each comment felt like another punch to the gut. But the hardest part wasn't the online backlash. It was the personal stories that began surfacing. Former employees came forward, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment at his hands. A young flight attendant recounted how she had been reprimanded after reporting his inappropriate remarks to management. Another junior pilot revealed how he had belittled her during training, making her doubt her abilities and nearly forcing her to quit. These accounts painted a picture of a man who thrived on power trips, using his position to intimidate and demean others. For the first time, he started to see himself through other people's eyes, and it wasn't pretty. The realization hit him like a freight train. All those years he had believed he was superior, untouchable, above reproach. But now, stripped bare of his titles and accolades, he saw the cracks in his own armor. Beneath the polished uniform and commanding presence lay someone insecure, defensive, and deeply flawed. Unable to cope with the guilt and regret eating away at him, he sought help. Therapy became his lifeline. At first, sitting in a counselor's office felt strange, almost humiliating. Admitting he needed help didn't come easily to a man who had always prided himself on being self-reliant. But as the sessions progressed, he began opening up about his upbringing, his insecurities, and the toxic beliefs that had shaped his worldview. Slowly but surely, he started confronting the root causes of his behavior. One breakthrough moment came when his therapist asked him a simple question. "Why do you think you felt threatened by that man on the plane?" The question caught him off guard. For weeks, he had focused on external factors, the pressures of the job, the expectations placed on pilots. But this was different. This forced him to look inward. "I guess I felt like he didn't belong," he admitted hesitantly. Not because of anything he did, but because of how he looked. Like seeing him there challenge some idea I had in my head about who deserves. What? His therapist nodded, encouraging him to dig deeper. Over time, he realized that much of his arrogance stemmed from fear. Fear of losing control, fear of not measuring up, fear of change. He had clung to his authority as a shield, using it to mask his insecurities. Understanding this didn't excuse his actions, but it gave him a starting point for growth. Determined to make amends, he began volunteering at youth programs aimed at mentoring aspiring pilots. At first, stepping into these spaces felt awkward. Many of the kids came from backgrounds vastly different from his own, and he worried they wouldn't trust him. But as he shared his story, his mistakes, his regrets, and his journey toward redemption, he found common ground. Some students confided in him, sharing their struggles with self-doubt or feeling out of place in industries dominated by privilege. Others simply appreciated having someone who listened without judgment. Though progress was slow, he started rebuilding his life piece by piece. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he hoped that by helping others, he could contribute something positive to the world. Redemption wasn't easy, and forgiveness, even from himself, felt distant. Yet every small step forward reminded him that change was possible, even for someone like him. Meanwhile, the airline faced its own reckoning. Public outrage hadn't subsided with the termination of the pilot. Instead, it intensified, with customers demanding systemic reforms. How could such behavior go unchecked for so long? Why hadn't earlier complaints been taken seriously? These questions forced the company to confront uncomfortable truths about its culture and practices. In response, executives announced sweeping changes. They implemented mandatory bias training for all staff, from pilots to ground crew, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of race, gender, or background. Policies were updated to ensure that reports of misconduct were addressed promptly and fairly, with clear consequences for violations. To foster greater diversity, the airline launched initiatives aimed at recruiting and supporting underrepresented groups in leadership roles. These efforts weren't perfect, and skepticism lingered among critics who questioned whether the changes were genuine or merely performative. Still, they marked a significant shift in mindset, an acknowledgement that accountability mattered and that real progress required action, not just words. As the weeks turned into months, the scandal faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories and controversies. But its impact lingered, rippling outward in ways both visible and unseen. For the man who had endured the humiliation, it reinforced his belief in the power of grace under pressure. For the pilot, it served as a painful yet transformative lesson about humility and humanity. And for the airline, it underscored the urgent need for reform in an industry still grappling with issues of inequality and injustice. Though their paths never crossed again, the lives of these individuals remained intertwined forever, not just by the events of that fateful flight, but by the lessons learned and the changes sparked in its aftermath. Months after the incident, life had settled into a new rhythm for everyone involved. The man who had been humiliated on the flight found himself in an unexpected position. He was no longer just a businessman quietly climbing the ladder of success. Instead, he had become a symbol, a face and voice for dignity, resilience, and standing up against injustice without resorting to bitterness. Invitations poured in from all corners of the globe. Universities wanted him to deliver keynote speeches. Community organizations asked him to lead workshops. Even corporations sought his advice on fostering inclusivity within their ranks. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't someone who craved the spotlight, and the idea of being labeled a public figure made him uncomfortable. But as he thought about it more, he realized this moment offered him a rare opportunity, an opening to create meaningful change. So, he accepted some of the invitations, carefully choosing platforms where he felt his message would resonate most deeply. In one particularly memorable speech, he stood before a packed auditorium at a prestigious university. The room buzzed with anticipation as students, professors, and community members waited to hear what he would say. When he began speaking, his tone was calm but powerful. "I didn't ask for any of this," he admitted, pacing slowly across the stage. But sometimes life puts you in situations that force you to reflect, not just on your own experiences, but on the bigger picture. What happened to me on that plane wasn't unique. It happens every day in small ways and big ones to people who look like me and to others who don't fit society's narrow definitions of belonging. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued. What matters isn't the act of humiliation itself, it's how we respond. Do we let anger consume us? Or do we rise above, refusing to let someone else's prejudice define us? His voice softened slightly. That doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending everything is fine. It means finding strength in vulnerability and using our experiences to push for progress. The audience erupted into applause when he finished, many listeners wiping away tears. Afterward, dozens of people lined up to thank him personally. A young woman told him his story gave her hope after years of feeling invisible in corporate spaces. An older man shared how he had faced similar discrimination decades earlier, but hadn't known how to articulate his feelings until now. These interactions reinforced his belief that sharing his truth could inspire others to share theirs. And together, they could build momentum for change. While the man embraced his newfound role as an advocate, the pilot grappled with rebuilding his life. Losing his career and reputation had left him adrift, unsure of who he was outside of the cockpit. Volunteering at youth programs helped fill the void, but it also forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Each interaction with aspiring pilots reminded him of the responsibility that came with authority, a responsibility he had failed to uphold during his own tenure. One afternoon, while mentoring a group of teenagers interested in aviation, a young boy raised his hand timidly. "What's the hardest part about being a pilot?" he asked. The question caught the former captain off guard. For years, he would have answered with something technical: long hours, unpredictable schedules, the pressure of keeping hundreds of lives safe. But now, his perspective had shifted. "The hardest part," he said slowly, "isn't flying the plane. It's remembering that you're not just there to operate the aircraft. You're there to serve, to treat everyone with respect, whether they're passengers, colleagues, or strangers. And honestly, I didn't always get that right." The honesty in his response surprised even himself. The kids stared at him wide-eyed, clearly unaccustomed to hearing adults admit fault so openly. One girl spoke up. "So, does that mean anyone can mess up and still try to fix things?" He nodded. "Exactly. We all make mistakes. The real test is whether we learn from them and work to do better." Watching the girl smile back at him, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that redemption wasn't out of reach, even for someone like him. As time passed, the airline continued its efforts to rebuild trust with customers. The reforms they implemented weren't perfect, but they represented a significant step forward. Mandatory bias training sessions became a cornerstone of employee development, encouraging staff to examine their own biases and challenge discriminatory behavior when they saw it. Leadership positions began to diversify, with individuals from underrepresented backgrounds stepping into roles that had long been dominated by privilege. Employees noticed the shift. Flight attendants reported feeling more empowered to speak up if they witnessed misconduct. Junior pilots described a workplace culture that felt less hierarchical and more collaborative. Passengers, too, commented on the improved atmosphere on board flights. While skepticism remained, some questioned whether the changes were genuine or merely cosmetic. The overall sentiment leaned toward cautious optimism. To ensure accountability, the airline established an independent oversight committee tasked with monitoring progress and addressing complaints. This move earned praise from advocacy groups, which highlighted the importance of transparency in driving lasting change. Still, critics pointed out that true transformation required sustained effort, not just flashy announcements or short-term fixes. For the man who had sparked the movement, seeing these changes unfold brought a sense of validation. During a meeting with airline executives, he emphasized the need for continuous improvement. Policies are important, he told them, but they're only as effective as the people implementing them. Real change starts with mindset, with recognizing that everyone deserves respect. regardless of their background. His involvement extended beyond consultations. He partnered with advocacy organizations to launch campaigns promoting inclusivity in travel and beyond. Social media played a key role in amplifying these initiatives, with hashtags like #Travel with Respect gaining traction worldwide. Stories poured in from travelers sharing positive experiences with airlines, hotels, and other service providers committed to treating all customers equally. Slowly but surely, the narrative around travel began shifting, from exclusivity to accessibility, from division to unity. Despite the progress, both the man and the airline understood that the journey was far from over. Systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. Yet each step forward mattered. Every policy change, every heartfelt apology, every act of kindness contributed to a larger tapestry of healing and growth. For the pilot, redemption remained a work in progress. Though he had distanced himself from the arrogance that once defined him, he knew earning forgiveness both from others and himself would take time. Some nights guilt kept him awake, replaying moments he wished he could undo. Other nights, memories of the young faces he mentored filled him with purpose. He learned to live with the duality of regret and hope, knowing neither could exist without the other. As the months turned into a year, the scandal faded from public memory, replaced by new headlines and fresh controversies, but its legacy endured. In the reforms it inspired, the conversations it sparked, and the lives it touched. For those directly involved, it served as a turning point, a catalyst for personal and collective transformation. They carried its lessons. With them, reminders that even in moments of darkness, humanity has the power to shine through. A year had passed since the fateful flight, and while time had moved forward, the ripple effects of that single incident continued to shape lives in profound ways. For the man who had been humiliated, the journey had transformed him in ways he never anticipated. What began as a deeply personal experience had evolved into something much larger, a movement that touched countless lives and sparked meaningful conversations about respect, dignity, and equality. He often reflected on how far he'd come since that day. Back then, he'd simply wanted to enjoy a peaceful flight without drama or confrontation. Instead, he found himself thrust into the spotlight, becoming an advocate for change in industries riddled with systemic biases. It wasn't a role he'd chosen, but it was one he embraced wholeheartedly. Through speeches, workshops, and partnerships with advocacy groups, he worked tirelessly to amplify voices that had long been silenced. One evening, sitting alone in his apartment after a long day of meetings, he scrolled through messages from people who had reached out to thank him. A young woman wrote about how his story inspired her to stand up against workplace discrimination. A father shared how he used the example of the pilot's downfall to teach his teenage son about accountability and humility. Each message reminded him why this fight mattered, not just for himself but for future generations. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Late at night, when the noise of the world faded away, he allowed himself to sit quietly with his thoughts. He remembered the sting of the pilot's words, the way they had cut deeper than any insult ever had before. Those memories hadn't disappeared. They lingered, like scars etched into his soul. But instead of letting them break him, he chose to let them fuel his purpose. "Pain can either destroy you or define you," he once said during an interview. "I decided to let mine define me, in a way that helps others." For the pilot, life looked vastly different now. Gone were the days of commanding respect as a uniformed figure of authority. In their place stood a man humbled by loss, learning to navigate a world where redemption felt both distant and necessary. Volunteering at youth programs became his anchor, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he lacked. The kids he mentored saw past his mistakes, focusing instead on the lessons he offered. They didn't care about his past arrogance, they cared about the wisdom he shared and the effort he put into helping them dream bigger. One afternoon, as he guided a group of teenagers through a flight simulator exercise, he noticed a girl lingering behind after the session ended. She approached him hesitantly, clutching a notebook filled with sketches of airplanes. "I want to be a pilot," she said shyly. but I don't think I'm good enough." Her words struck a chord within him. He knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Do you know what makes a great pilot?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "It's not perfection. It's persistence. You'll make mistakes along the way, and that's okay. What matters is that you keep going no matter what anyone says." As he spoke, he thought about his own journey, the arrogance that had once defined him, the fall that had shattered him, and the slow climb toward rebuilding himself. He realized that his failures weren't just his burden to bear, they could also be tools for teaching others. By sharing his story, warts and all, he hoped to show these kids that growth was possible, even after the worst mistakes. Meanwhile, the airline underwent its own transformation. The reforms it implemented weren't perfect solutions, but they represented progress. Employees reported feeling safer speaking up about misconduct, knowing their concerns would be taken seriously. Leadership positions began reflecting greater diversity, breaking down barriers that had existed for decades. Passengers noticed the shift too, commenting on social media about improved interactions with staff and a more welcoming atmosphere on board flights. Yet, challenges remained. Some critics argued that the changes were cosmetic, designed to appease public outrage rather than address deep-rooted issues. Others pointed out that true inclusivity required ongoing commitment, not just initial efforts. To combat skepticism, the airline doubled down on transparency, publishing regular updates on its progress and inviting feedback from customers and employees alike. The man who had sparked the movement played a pivotal role in guiding these efforts. During meetings with executives, he emphasized the importance of staying vigilant. "Change isn't a destination," he told them. "It's a process. If you stop pushing forward, you risk slipping back into old habits." His words resonated deeply, reminding everyone involved that complacency was the enemy of progress. As the months turned into years, the scandal faded further from public memory, replaced by news stories and emerging challenges. But its impact endured. In the policies enacted, the conversations started and the lives changed. For the man, it reinforced his belief in the power of resilience and grace under pressure. For the pilot, it served as a humbling reminder of the dangers of unchecked arrogance and prejudice. And for the airline, it underscored the urgent need for accountability and reform. Though their paths never crossed again, the connection between them remained, an invisible thread woven through the fabric of their lives. Their actions, choices, and reflections shaped not only their individual journeys but also the broader narrative of justice and humanity. In the end, the story of the arrogant pilot and the resilient businessman became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a beacon of hope, a testament to the idea that even in moments of darkness, light could emerge. It showed that accountability, though painful, was essential for growth. And it proved that every person, regardless of their background or mistakes, had the capacity to learn, evolve, and contribute to a better world. As the man boarded another international flight, this time greeted warmly by attentive staff, he glanced out the window at the clouds below. Somewhere out there, he knew, others were carrying the lessons of that fateful day with them. Lessons about standing tall in the face of adversity, about owning your mistakes and striving to do better, and about the enduring power of human dignity. And in that knowledge, he found peace.